Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. We are here for a webinar on the Division I legislative proposals for the 2021-22 legislative cycle. My name is Karen Metzger. I'm an associate director here in Academic and Membership Affairs. One of my primary job responsibilities is working with Division I legislation. With me here today, you will hear Ty Med and Emily Capehart, also both members of the Division I legislation team here in AMA. We can now roll into general legislative reminders that are up on your screen now. The voting chart has gone out. What the voting chart is essentially a list of, or a chart, hence the name, of the proposals in the voting order that we can expect at the April Division I Council meeting. So as you'll be able to see in the voting chart, council members will know what to expect in terms of the voting order, starting with the modernization track proposals and those proposals related to them. Proposals with the broadest scope are considered first. After those modernization track proposals and the proposals directly related to those, the voting will then move into the proposed consent package and then all remaining proposals. Just as a reminder, non-controversial legislation is on a 75% voting threshold, while remaining proposals, standard proposals, are on that simple majority. New amendments may be considered on the floor, so to speak, during the council meeting. They cannot increase the scope of the original proposal. Another important note is the finality of legislation. Non-controversial legislation is final at the conclusion of the council meeting, which again is April 14th. And that it makes sense because of the increased voting threshold, for non-controversial legislation to be adopted at that 75% threshold. All other legislation adopted by council is not final until the conclusion of the board of directors meeting, and that is on April 27th. That includes immediately effective legislation. So if immediately effective standard legislation is adopted at the council meeting, that legislation will be effective after the board of directors meeting on April 27th. An amendment with less than 85% threshold is subject to a rescission period. As you can see up on the screen, those need to be approved by the chancellor or president of the university. And if 2/3 of the impacted membership submit a request to rescind, that's when that rescission is triggered. Defeated proposals may not be submitted as concepts again for 2 years. And then we can move on into our proposals themselves. And to kick us off with some recruiting legislation and some other items, I will hand it off to Ty Med.
Okay, thanks, Karen. We will go ahead and start with the modernization proposals that we anticipate will be voted on during the April council meeting, as well as the other proposals that touch the same areas of the legislation as modernization proposals. And we'll start with 2022-3, which would change the trigger for student athlete status to align with flexibility that has existed during the previous 2 academic years. A prospect here would trigger student athlete status once that prospect provides the institution with written commitment and completes all relevant academic requirements. The individual does need to enroll at the first opportunity, otherwise they will revert back to prospect status. In order, if you revert back to get back to a student athlete status, one of the current triggers would have to be used. There is additional guidance on this proposal as a question and answer document on the Legislative Actions and Issues webpage. So that brings us to the proposals that touch on the length of an official visit. So staff does anticipate there will be a motion for a divided vote on proposal 2022. For the expectation is to divide the vote between basketball and all other sports. Proposals 2022-4 and 2021-23 both address the current 48-hour length of official visit rule. The modernization proposal would eliminate that 48-hour rule and measures the length of a visit by the provision of 2 consecutive nights of lodging expenses. Conversely, the basketball proposal would condense the official visit in basketball specifically to 36 hours with no more than 2 nights of lodging provided. That brings us to the number of official visits proposals. We also anticipate that there will be a divided vote on proposal 2022-5 between basketball and all other sports. Both 2022-5 and 2021-22 talk about the total number of official visits an individual prospect may take. The modernization proposal would eliminate the limit on number of official visits for a prospect. Existing legislation limiting 1 visit per institution and sport-specific limits on the overall number of visits that may be provided on an annual basis would continue to apply. The men's basketball proposal would reduce the number of visits a men's basketball prospect may take from 5 to 3 during each relevant period. The last modernization proposal that is anticipated to be voted on in April is proposal 2022-6, which would prohibit in-person off-campus contact between coaches and prospects during the time of day when a prospect's classes are in session. This would be the expansion of a rule that currently exists in basketball to all other sports. So the next group of proposals we will review apply only to football and seek to change either signing and initial counter legislation or adjust the football recruiting calendar. We'll start with 2019-41, and this annual signing and initial counter proposal would address roster management issues that stem from counters departing for professional opportunities or becoming medical non-counters. Specifically here, an institution would be able to increase the annual and initial counter signing limit by 1 for each counter who becomes ineligible after entering the NFL draft, and for each medical non-counter. Additional guidance on this proposal is included in the council governance proposals question and answer document. 2019-42 would adjust the annual signing and initial counter limits to permit an institution to have 50 initial counters in a rolling 2-year period, but not more than 30 initial counters in any given year. Further, the annual signing limit would be increased to 30 on an annual basis. And the last initial counter annual signing limit proposal is 2019-43, which would allow the replacement of an individual who counts against the annual signing limit in certain circumstances, specifically when an individual receives a full release from the National Letter of Intent, does not enroll at the institution, or has their financial aid permissibly canceled. The institution may replace those individuals who count against the annual signing limit. The last football specific proposal in the recruiting space that we have is proposal number 2019-61, which would establish a limited graduate transfer contact period during the spring. The contact period would be in place for individuals who are in the transfer portal and who have graduated or will graduate, and that contact period would occur from Monday of the week that includes the initial date for regular signing, and then through the initial signing of a National Letter of Intent and through April 14th. The next group of recruiting proposals that we're going to take a look at are in the areas of publicity, tryouts, and camps and clinics. We will start with the one publicity proposal in this year's cycle, and this proposal clarifies the application of publicity legislation following written commitment. So once a prospect signs a National Letter of Intent, all publicity legislation is lifted if a prospect does not sign a national letter of intent and only signs an offer of financial aid or deposits after being admitted. Publicity restrictions are not lifted until after the first date of the regular signing period. This clarifies some sport-specific issues in this space, and additional guidance regarding this proposal is also included in the council governance proposals question and answer document. Proposal 2019-48 would limit the types of national team activities that an institution may host in women's gymnastics. An exception for national and regional USA Gymnastics Junior Olympic camps is included in the proposal, provided the opportunity to host is available to all collegiate institutions, and an institution only hosts these camps once every 4 years. 2019-50 would prohibit a wrestling coach's involvement primarily with regional training centers and other state, regional, national, and international programs. Under this proposal, coaches would still be able to coach their student athletes in open event competition against prospects. And we do have some additional question and answers in the council governance proposal question and answer document on this proposal as well. 2019-52 would limit the time periods when an institution may conduct a camp or clinic. Specifically, institutional camps and clinics would only be able to occur during June, July, August, and then December 15th through February 1st. There is a bit of an exception in the immediate date, in the effective date for this one. A contract signed before June 23rd, 2021 may be honored. And similarly, a camp that was publicized prior to June 23rd, 2021 may be conducted outside these specified periods. Again, additional guidance regarding this proposal is included in the council governance proposals question and answer document. That brings us to our last camp-related proposal, which would eliminate the ability for camp staff to provide a campus tour during an institutional camp in sports other than women's basketball. A tour of the facilities used during the camp would remain permissible, and campers would be permitted to participate in an admissions tour, provided there is no involvement by the athletic department. The next slate of proposals from a recruiting standpoint are going to address sport-specific recommendations for changes to either the recruiting process or recruiting calendars. We start with 2019-62, which adds dead periods surrounding Thanksgiving and signing day to the recruiting calendar in women's golf. Additionally, this proposal would create an annual limit of 80 evaluation days. Proposal 2019-63 is relatively straightforward. It just adds a dead period during NCAA outdoor track and field regional meets. This brings us to the baseball recruiting model. So we start 2019-108 represents a new early recruiting model for baseball. If adopted, the recruiting process for baseball prospects will start earlier in their high school career. This proposal generally aligns the baseball recruiting model with the recruiting model that currently exists in men's ice hockey. We have received an amendment to the amendment. So 2019-108 as a base assumes that 2019-108 is adopted. And the proposed amendment here addresses the specific recruiting activity that could begin on January 1st, rather than that first permissible date be January 1st of a prospective student athlete's sophomore year. The start date under 2019-1081 would be the Monday following the Coaches Association convention, and that convention typically occurs in the first week of January. The last recruiting calendar proposal we've got is 2019-114, which adds several dead periods to the recruiting calendar in wrestling. Specifically, we're looking at the addition of dead periods surrounding Thanksgiving, Christmas, the NCAA championship, and the coaches convention. And as we see, there is a little bit of a quiet period exception for home football games. Moving on from recruiting, we've got two proposals in this year's cycle that represent adjustments to the medical hardship waiver process. Specifically, proposal 2021-17 would standardize the medical hardship calculations on a sport-specific basis. So rather than using scheduled or completed contests to determine whether medical hardship criteria are met, this new model calculates that medical hardship criteria using the maximum contest limits in bylaw 17. Additionally, the proposal would exclude scrimmages and exhibitions, as well as bylaw 17 exemptions from the medical hardship waiver calculations. Proposal 2021-18 would adjust the rounding rule to provide student athletes additional opportunities to qualify for a medical hardship waiver. Additional guidance on both 2021-17 and 2021-18 is included in the council governance proposals question and answer document. And with that, I will turn it to Emily to talk about the infractions program proposals.
Thanks, Ty. So the next three proposals, as Ty mentioned, 2019-130, 129, and the last one are three proposals from the previous legislative cycle that are all dealing with changes to how penalties are used in the infraction space. Rather than go into great detail on either of these, two are kind of different approaches to the use of vacation of records as a penalty, and one pertains to kind of the minimum financial penalty in the infraction space. The legislative committee talked about these in February, and in light of the ongoing review of the Division I infractions process, they are going to recommend that the council table these three proposals rather than take action in light of, again, the holistic review of the infractions process. So you should, as Karen mentioned in the voting chart that has gone out the door today, you should see that indicated there as the recommendation from the legislative committee. So now I'm going to talk about 21-25, and this is a proposal to, it's a package proposal to help improve really the academic outcomes of men's wrestling student athletes. And so this is one of those proposals that you'll see touching really pieces of legislation throughout our operating bylaws, beginning in bylaw 12 through bylaw 14, 15, and as well as bylaw 17. The Committee on Academics put this proposal together, and they truly see all elements of this proposal kind of acting together to hopefully, again, improve both kind of the ongoing academic performance and retention of men's wrestling student athletes. Again, there was kind of an in-depth study of APP data for the sport of men's wrestling that prompted the Committee on Academics to come up with this proposal. And ultimately what that means is that there will be, again, if adopted, new requirements, but also kind of some new benefits for men's wrestling student athletes. So the first part of this in bylaw 12 would be to allow men's wrestling student athletes a minimum amount of competition during that redshirt year to have that experience with their team, but ultimately, again, not use that season of competition as long as they don't compete in more than the limited amount of competition that's allowed during that redshirt year. So that's what you'll see in bylaw 12. In the progress towards degree space, there's an enhanced GPA requirement for men's wrestling student athletes. The data indicated that there was academic risk shown very early on in some men's wrestling trends. And so you'll see that their GPA minimum for to maintain, again, eligibility for competition with progress towards degree would go into effect right after the first regular full-time term for men's wrestling student athletes. So that's a little bit earlier than the rest of Division I student athletes. On the financial aid side, you'll see that there would be a minimum equivalency required in the sport of men's wrestling, not too dissimilar from how baseball currently works. The idea behind this is that will help perhaps better retain more men's wrestling student athletes to have that minimum kind of financial commitment from their program. And then in the outside competition space, a little bit of scaling back during the freshman year. The idea behind that is that because they've because this proposal would create that change in bylaw 12 to preserve that season of competition, that the additional outside competition that is often seen in the sport of men's wrestling doesn't need to kind of coincide with that proposed flexibility in bylaw 12. And so you'll see that change reflected in the proposal, as well as kind of once you're outside of that freshman year, also needing to maintain the minimum GPA in order to permissibly engage in the outside competition as well, just to ensure, I think, that the student athletes who are engaging in permissible outside competition are maintaining the academic progress that this proposal overall is designed to encourage. So 2021-26 is simply opening up post-grad transfer student athletes, the student athletes who have earned that baccalaureate degree. Currently, they default really to the one-time transfer exception criteria, which for undergrads is 14.55210. And that's truly, legislatively, that's the only exception that postgrads can be certified under. And so what this proposal would do would essentially open the door for any exception, any undergraduate four-year transfer exception found under 14.552 to be available for a postgrad. I think the example that is most commonly referenced as potentially useful for postgrads would be the non-recruited, non-scholarship exception, or sometimes we call it the walk-on exception. So if you have a postgrad student athlete who was not on scholarship at their previous school that offered scholarships in their sport, and they've just earned their baccalaureate degree from that institution, you would be able to certify them under that exception as a postgrad, which currently is not allowed. You would need to go through either use 14.661, the one-time transfer exception, but if the student has previous transfer history, you're not going to be able to use that, and so you're in the waiver space. So the idea behind this is, look, we have a bunch of relatively, narrower specific exceptions that work well for the undergraduates. If you have a postgraduate who is coming from that same context, they should similarly be afforded access to those exceptions as well. So that's the idea behind 2021-26. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Karen.
Thanks, Emily. All right, moving on into proposal 2019-23. This is a proposal about waivers of the 5-year rule. So under existing legislation, a student athlete has to have 2 denied participation opportunities or one DPO, so to speak, and one red shirt that occurs during the student athlete's first year of collegiate enrollment. So what this would do is allow that red shirt to occur in any year. There are some examples in the question and answer document that's on legislative actions and issues on .org, but one of the most common questions that we get about this is whether or not you could use 2 red shirts to get to that waiver. And the answer to that is no, you will still need 2 or 1 denied participation opportunity and 1 red shirt. The only difference with this proposal would be that red shirt does not need to be in the first year of collegiate enrollment. Moving on to probably our oldest proposal in this cycle is 2018-76. This is another one that has some pretty detailed questions and answers in the Q&A on .org in terms of practical application. So as we know, when calculating equivalencies at the end of the year or projecting them in the beginning of the year, we need to be very careful to use actual over actual methodology or average over average methodology. You can't mix and match methodologies, so to speak. What this proposal from the Big 12 would do is allow institutions to use any method that they see fit when calculating that equivalency. They'd be able to do actual over average, average over actual, break it up by element, use different methodologies by student athlete, by team. Any way that the institution wants to do that calculation would be appropriate. And again, I really recommend reading through the practical questions and answers in that Q&A document. Moving on, and still roughly in the financial aid space, is 2019-64. This would allow institutions to go ahead and provide athletics aid to student athletes while they're in that temporary certification period, that 45-day window where they're not able to compete or receive athletics aid, but they can go ahead and practice while awaiting their certification. This would avoid that delay in getting a student's financial aid to them. And the probably most common question that we get with this proposal is whether or not the student athlete would be a counter. Yes, regardless of whether or not that student ultimately turns out to be eligible for that aid, that student would trigger counter status. And on the rare instance that that student later came out to be ineligible, the institution would need to cancel that aid at that point and then prorate it from the point of cancellation, from that point that they are not eligible. They would not need to claw back to the original point, that the student athlete was originally awarded that aid. Moving on to 2019-75, this proposal would allow participation in summer access if a student athlete is not in summer school, if that student athlete after 8 semesters or 12 quarters, so our rising 5th years, is enrolled in everything needed for graduation that upcoming year. So it is a slightly more flexible window of opportunity for those student athletes that might not be enrolled in summer school. So again, it would allow those rising 5th year students enrolled in all remaining coursework for the graduation the next academic year, as opposed to the current sport specific rules. Moving on to proposal 2019-81. This would essentially create summer access for women's soccer and women's volleyball. The most common question we get with this one, and it is not up on the slide here, is does this put in place summer school enrollment requirements for student athletes in these sports as well? And the answer is yes. There is a sport-specific rule or rule specific to women's soccer and women's volleyball in this proposal as well, where a student athlete who is on scholarship would need to be enrolled in summer school unless they meet one of the exceptions. Moving on into proposal 2019-78, this proposal would allow institutions to permit for those voluntary workouts that are student athletes in individual sports already utilized those situations where a student requests a workout with their coaching staff during a vacation period. It's initiated by the student athlete, requested by them. It's permissible in our individual sports, but in team sports, it has not been. So what this would do is extend that opportunity to those student athletes participating in team sports to have those voluntary workouts in those vacation periods. Most common question we're getting on this one is, can that be multiple student athletes, or would it have to be just an individual student athlete? And in the question and answer document, you can refer back to it, but it does allow multiple student athletes to utilize this voluntary workout. But again, stressing that it is initiated and requested by participating student athletes. Moving on to 2019-82. This rule or this proposal would standardize and simplify the determination of those first practice dates in the listed sports by using calendar days instead of units. So in cross country, field hockey, soccer, men's water polo, that first practice date would be 16 calendar days before the first regular season contest. Similar in women's volleyball, just 17 days before the first regular season contest. Most common question we get on this one is about the exceptions in the practice units definition in 1702.13. Again, this is about calendar days and getting away from the practice units calculation. Moving to 2019-85. This proposal would modify the academic orientation period to allow that to be during anytime during preseason, as long as it's before the 11th day of school, or allow institutions to utilize institutional programming open to all incoming students as long as that programming occurs during or before that 5-day acclimatization period in football. It's important to note in this one, it's an example of a divided vote. So there will be separate votes for both FCS and FBS as this sport-specific rule comes for vote, and that would be noted on the voting chart. Next proposal is 2019-86. We have received notification from the sponsor of this proposal that we are expecting it to be withdrawn on the council floor. At this point in the legislative cycle, that does need to happen at the actual council meeting. Typically, there is no objection when that request is made by the sponsor that they would like to withdraw. So we do not anticipate this proposal coming for vote at this time. Rather than spend time on this proposal, we did want to make sure to include it to let the membership know that we do anticipate this to be withdrawn. 2019-87 will move up the first permissible contest date, if adopted, for those institutions competing abroad for that first contest. So to balance that out, the proposal would require 5 additional days off during the season to make up for that moving up of the first permissible contest date to the Saturday prior to the Thursday preceding Labor Day if that contest is played in a foreign country. Next up is 2019-88. This is essentially a new playing season model. It would specify that the first practice session of the championship segment is January 7th. It would also mirror the current women's lacrosse rule to allow student athletes to engage in some limited scrimmage and exhibition opportunities without using a season of competition. If you'd like to refresh yourself on that specific legislation, you could refer to bylaw 128314 in addition to this proposal itself. Proposal 2019-90. This is a proposal that anyone who is familiar with men's soccer is pretty familiar with by this point in the legislative cycle. It is essentially designed to better align with professional and international soccer. It does break up the season into a 2-semester season. It does maintain that 132-day, 22-week season, but it splits it over 2 semesters, as you see up on the slide here. We've not received a significant number of interpretive questions on this proposal, but if you do have any questions, feel free to utilize our RSRO as usual. Moving to our women's volleyball contest proposals. Under current legislation, we are limited to 28 dates of competition in women's volleyball. Again, it's important to note that that is dates of competition. These two proposals, 2019-92 and 2019-93, would shift that to contests rather than dates of competition. The only difference is the number of contests between each proposal. So in 2019-92, that proposal would allow for 32 total contests, while 2019-93 from the Big 12 would allow 30 total contests. So again, shifting from dates of competition to contests. Next up, we have another proposal from the Big Sky that we do anticipate being withdrawn from the cycle. So again, at this point in the legislative cycle, that will need to happen at the council meeting. But as I said on the previous proposal where we discussed this, we do not anticipate any objection to that. And we do expect that this will be withdrawn at the council meeting in April. Moving to proposal 2021-28, this proposal was designed to promote the growth of women's beach volleyball, specifically as a distinct sport from indoor. So what this would do is allow pairs tournaments in the non-championship segment to count as one date rather than multiple, and eliminate rules related to ground transportation within that 400 miles, and then allow missed class time during the non-championship or associated with that non-championship competition. So shift in women's beach volleyball designed to promote the growth of that sport. 2019-22 is specific to national service academies. This proposal would allow national service academies to employ one additional coach, up to 4 in men's ice hockey. The reason for this, and there is similar legislation in basketball, is to account for these institutions' unique inability to utilize student assistant coaches. So again, allowing those service academies to employ one additional coach, so 4 in men's ice hockey. Next up, speaking of men's ice hockey, or really this is ice hockey generally, what this proposal would do is avoid the common problem in ice hockey today of the first date of practice and the first date of competition occurring on the same day. So what 2021-29 would do is avoid that issue and promoting student athlete well-being by moving up preseason practice without moving up that first permissible contest date. So that would allow for 5 dates of practice before competition would be allowed. And this would not result in an increase in the total number of days of the season. It would just move that date up. So essentially the institution would need to take more time off during the season. 2021-30 is along similar lines. It would allow scrimmages and exhibitions starting on that, again, same first contest date, to avoid opening with full-fledged competition. So it allows for those scrimmages and exhibitions on that first permissible date of competition. 2019-1-24 is sponsored by the Women's Basketball Oversight Committee, or more specifically Division I Council, but originated with the Women's Basketball Oversight Committee. It adds an exemption for one U.S. national team contest, and this aligns with the Women's Basketball Strategic Plan in relation for growth of the sport of women's basketball. All right, rounding this home stretch here, we have proposal 2019-126. This adds 4 dates of non-championship competition in water polo. It specifies that the 21 dates currently allowed will be during the championship segment, and as you see up under on the slide under proposed rule, adds up to 4 dates of competition during the non-championship segment. Proposal 2019-122, this is another one where I would encourage referring to the question and answer document on ncaa.org on that legislative actions and issues tab. This proposal standardizes the exceptions for season-ending events, which currently vary by sport. So it would, again, standardize across all sports other than basketball and football and allow one season-ending event, such as the NCAA championship in NIT. And last, we have proposal 2021-16. Currently, no such designation related to senior minority administrator exists. This proposal would establish a definition of senior minority administrator at both the institution and conference level as the highest ranking minority administrator involved in the conduct, decision-making, supervision, and policy processes of the institution or conference. All right, we've reached the end of our proposals here today. All right, thank you very much for your attendance here today. So have a wonderful afternoon and thank you again.